Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Hansen. I'm a 2L here at Colorado Law and Secretary of the Silicon Flatiron Student Group. I'm delighted to introduce our next panel, the Administrative State and Tech Access. This panel will examine how recent Supreme Court decisions, executive action, and shifting federal, state, and agency dynamics are reshaping tech policy and access. To inform this discussion, the panel will consider implications on the Universal Service Fund, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Humphrey Executor's precedent. Together, these issues highlight what is at stake for the future of the administrative state and for equitable access to technology. Moderating this panel is Reid, Associate Professor at Colorado Law and Faculty Director of the Telecom and Platform Initiative at Silicon Flatirons. Before I turn it over to Blake to introduce our expert panelists, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panel.
While folks are filing in, let me just take a moment and embarrass Sarah. We're talking about admin law on this panel. Sarah's my research assistant. I can't think of someone in the building who is as driven and excited about administrative law and capable of finding deep, exciting things in administrative law jurisprudence. Are you looking for a job, Sarah? All right, hire Sarah. Comes with my unequivocal recommendation. Okay, one thing that has been a constant at Silicon Flatirons for I think the kind of 25 years we've been doing this conference is discussing the key federal agencies that govern tech policy, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission. I think today we'll probably talk about the NTIA, the Copyright Office, and the PTO might come up as well. And we normally aim to look around the corner at what's next. But I think so much has happened with federal agencies in the last year that we might find ourselves asking whether there's any corner left at all. So the question that we are tasked with is, where do federal tech policy agencies stand a year into the second Trump administration? And we thought we would divide this question up into four parts. We're going to think about the relationship between federal agencies and the president, for one, the courts, for two, Congress, for three, and state governments for four. We're going to aim to spend about 15 or 20 minutes on each. And to discuss it, we have assembled a team of friendly foes, agreeable disagreeers, a cabinet of rivals, if you will. And for the president, someone who knows how to execute, the most presidential person on the panel. And by that, I mean, we have the president and CEO of Public Knowledge, Chris Lewis. For the courts, we have someone who is fair-minded, eminently reasonable, and more than a little judgmental, Gus Hurwitz, who is the senior fellow and academic director at the U.Penn Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition at the University of Pennsylvania. For Congress, someone who walks the halls, speaks for the people, at least some of the people, Jennifer Huddleston, who's a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. And for the states, we thought we really need someone from outside the Beltway, and we couldn't get any further away physically or metaphorically than Berkeley, California, which is where Tejas Narechania hails from. He's a professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. With that, let's get to the president. Chris, I am old enough to remember about a decade ago when there was a lot of consternation about the president recording a rather anodyne YouTube video in favor of a FCC policy matter, net neutrality, that led to years of hearings about the intrusions on the independence of the agency. I assume nothing has changed and that your update on where things stand will be very brief. Over to you.
Wow. I'm overwhelmed by Blake's comedic timing. Yeah, things have changed a lot. There is a war on independent agencies going on. And if you don't believe it, believe the people who are waging the war, because they say they're waging a war against independent agencies and the regulatory state. I think President Trump is leading the charge. Of course, Congress and the courts, and we'll talk about Congress and the courts and states have a role in it, but I think they're ratifying actions largely coming from the executive. And And it's driven by the concept of unitary executive theory. This is the idea, if folks are not familiar with it by now, that executive action, so rulemaking and spending appropriated funds and even monetary policy, basically anything that isn't creating laws or interpreting laws is under the power of one person, the president. And that means that independent agencies should not be independent. That's the theory, that they should be under the control of the president based on the Constitution. And we've even seen the president choose to ignore laws, so verging into the legislative front. The president has ignored laws outside tech policy, but in our own sector, things like ignoring the Digital Equity Act that was passed by Congress and signed by the president, or changing how they're going to hand out appropriations or funds, like in the BEAD program, or completely ignoring the letter of the law on the TikTok ban. This was all done by the president over the last year. Unitary executive theory is meant to increase the power of the presidency, and I believe it is for power's sake that we're seeing a president expand it, not always for any one policy reason, but to exert power, because power is what is most important when you want to control the debate, when you want to control communications and information, when you want to control who can influence policymaking, when you want to control culture. The unitary executive theory is and the expansion of power over independent agencies is about that exertion of power and less about policy, which usually is what we're debating up here. I don't know if you want me to go into deeper examples, but
let me ask you one quick follow-up, Chris, which is we have invoked the notion of independent agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we have independent agencies? Why has the independence of these agencies been important from your perspective?
Well, for folks who believe in agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC being independent, and that excludes the current chairman of the FCC, these were created to help, I believe, bring expertise into policymaking in discrete sectors. And so it's important to have an expert regulatory body that is independent and can do long-term work on a sector like communications policy. I think you heard Tim Wu making the case for that in his fireside chat to some degree earlier today. And they can do it with a level of expertise that Congress, quite frankly, can't always do because Congress has jurisdiction over every sector. And they can be flexible. If they overregulate, they can adjust rules back under the authority given to them by Congress. And they have oversight from Congress, but they're independent of the executive who might have short-term political desires and considerations that should not go into the expert analysis.
All right, I think we've got three excellent subtopics on the table here: the unitary executive theory, the ignorance or derogation of law, and the sort of arrogation of power. And let me open it up to the panel, and maybe let's start with the unitary executive theory for thoughts. Gus, to you.
Oh, sure. Whole lot of thoughts. And I won't say too much because I'll be talking about the courts and what's going on in the courts. Item 4 on my list is Slaughter, Humphrey's Executor, all that stuff. Okay. But I would start by noting, so unitary executive didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not a Trump administration idea. It goes back to the 1980s and before, but it really started to come to the fore with the structural revolution, separation of powers cases, 1970s, 1980s. And not just since then, but I'll use that Tim mentioned earlier. We have to have a date certain when we're talking about when revolutions occur. Since then, every president has made more and more aggressive use of executive power. And I think absolutely what's going on with the Trump administration is a step beyond, but this is a trajectory that we have been on. And the reason that I want to frame things up there, in the Slaughter oral arguments, the Humphrey's Executor case oral arguments, Justice Kagan made what I think is a really critical point, which is that all of these agencies were created with an understanding, a background understanding of what the equilibrium relationship between the different branches of government and the agencies were. And if we do away with independent agencies, the independence of agencies, that's changing that equilibrium. Well, yeah, that's really interesting because Chevron did that and INS v. Chadha did that in very dramatic way back in the 1980s. I think we are at the culmination of a disruption of the equilibrium that existed at the time these agencies were created, and the current equilibrium doesn't work. So we're in a period of disequilibrium, rethinking, rebalancing, and the hardest question there is, what's the role of Congress in all of this? And I know we'll get into some of that.
All right, before we get to courts, before we get to Congress, let me go to Jen for reactions on the unitary executive theory.
Yeah, I was going to kind of pick up in some of what Gus mentioned about Congress, and I think that that's a lot of the question is also why do we see so much more action by executive order, by the agencies? How do we see this potentially being checked by the courts? But also why is this the primary form of regulation we're seeing, particularly in the tech sector these days, but also more generally? And I don't think that it's as Gus was pointing out, that we can just say that this is a Trump administration issue. You can look at something like the Biden EO on AI, where you had something that looked very much like legislation done by executive order. Similarly, as Chris alluded to, I think there are a lot of questions around the Trump administration's decision to continually extend the TikTok deadline beyond what was available in statute by executive order. Even if you think it is good that TikTok stayed available as a platform for expression, that we didn't see the government shutting down that platform for expression, we still have to ask important questions about the underlying use of executive power and what that may mean in terms of how that executive power could be used beyond any particular administration.
Excellent. Tejas.
Yeah, let me say two things. One sort of about the law as it's developed, and then one about sort of related to the question you asked, Chris, about why do we care about independence? So I guess I agree with Gus that the unitary executive and the sort of trajectory of executive power we've been on this trajectory for some time, right? The unitary executive theory has a long history. In some senses, you might say that it really found its footing in a fever dream by Justice Scalia. But like, if you were to really, I think, dig down into it, like it's the law, the theory rests on a thin reed of text in the Constitution. The way the way Article 2 is drafted, and then you turn to the original evidence in favor of the unitary executive, and most of the original evidence in favor of the unitary executive theory goes back to common law England and the king. But if you think of the Constitution as a break from England and the monarchy, then it's not clear how relevant that evidence ought to be. And all the founding era evidence is really quite ambiguous. So all of which is to say, like, okay, somebody dreamt this up in Morrison, and we've been on this trajectory for a while, and we can rely on formalism to do the unitary executive thing, or we can be thoughtful. And we can sort of, do we want independent agencies? Do we want a regulatory structure that is not just the president gets to do whatever they want, but is instead, like, do we think it is better to have an agency that is subject to oversight by Congress? That is, if we think that there are in communications contexts concerns about demagoguery and propaganda, then maybe what we want is that agency that's in charge of the media to be responsible to the supervision of Congress, which is more representative in that it's proportionally drawn from the states and like has a variety of viewpoints that better represent us. And so I think there's a lot of value in those independent agencies, just in terms of what they mean for our representative democracy. And I've gone on long enough.
Chris.
Well, and I would just argue, we decided this when Congress passed law to create these independent agencies. I mean, Gus brought up the the Humphrey's Executor case and the firing of Commissioner Slaughter and at the FTC, it seems ridiculous to me that Congress passed a law to create an agency like the FTC or the FCC, because there's threats there that minority commissioners could be fired there as well. And then puts into the statute that there will be minority commissioners. You know, some commissioners can be the party of the president, but not more than this many. And so that by default means there are minority commissioners by law. And then to say that they can just be fired, it's as if you assume that every commissioner must agree with the president on every policy. And that just flies in the face of the intent of the statute.
So I want to ask before we leave this, I think we've alluded in fairly abstract terms to why we might want to have independent agencies, or what we might lose if we get rid of independent agencies. But I wonder if folks have any concrete examples or things that you are the most worried about if you think that the loss of independence is a problem. What are the things you're most worried are going to go? Or if anyone feels the other way and thinks, you know, there are maybe some upsides to having this fourth branch of government that's floating out nebulously in the world and acting without these clear paths of oversight that the unitary executive theory contemplates. I don't know if anyone takes that view, but let's take up that before we move on to the courts. What do we stand to lose here?
So we're already losing an independent and free press. The difference between what happened in the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration is stark. The president is a master of the bully pulpit. He is excellent at it. And yet when he would criticize or critique the opinions and the operation of news outlets in the first administration, Chairman Pai would kind of say, oh yeah, I might agree with them, but he actually said outright he wasn't going to act on some of those complaints. We've seen the opposite with the Jimmy Kimmel censorship and plenty of others manipulating print and TV broadcasts, journalism outlets to try to get on the message of the president and not on their own independent views.
So Blake, I'll give you some controversy. Since I know that's what you're asking for, with trying not to turn this into an admin law class. So if this were an admin law class, I'd go back and talk about that transmission belt understanding of why we have agencies in the first place, and the expertise understanding of why we have agencies, both independent and otherwise, and then the presidential administration understanding of why we have agencies. We've gone through all of these different understandings of why we have agencies, and with independent agencies, we tend to focus on the expertise. We bring together a panel that represents different perspectives. It's really weird to me that they're almost always lawyers, and that we don't have more technical.
We have all the important disciplines represented.
Yes. But increasingly, so many of the high stakes, big picture fights that we have at these agencies are political. And the presidential administration understanding, which Justice Kagan wrote that article, is more along the lines that if these agencies are making political decisions, we want them to be more directly accountable to political entities, and the president is the most at the biggest level politically accountable individual. So let's have the good God, the every 4 years, that election is a referendum, not just on the president, but also, do we like what's going on at the FCC with these policies or not? Now, that's one understanding. If these are just political fights and they're not technical expert fights that we're having, then yeah, maybe these should be rendered in the political domain. So that's one pushback that you can have.
Tejas?
Yeah, so but I guess, sure. So I think we should want and value political accountability, but the political accountability doesn't have to come by way of the executive. That is, you can imagine, and we have systems of congressional oversight, and Congress is even more politically responsive than the executive. So I don't disagree with you, but an independent agency refers to independence from the executive, but it doesn't mean independence from politics. Mm-hmm. And I think that the FCC and the FTC are subject to plenty of oversight from Congress, and that oversight matters.
So if I can jump in here, because I was actually going to be put on I'm supposed to be talking about Congress hat here too. And that I do think Tejas is right. One of the elements that we aren't asking in this question is, are we seeing adequate congressional oversight of these independent agencies? And I think there probably would be some debate amongst this panel about, have we seen these agencies overstep, particularly in either this current administration or in previous administrations? And have we seen Congress respond? We do know Congress can respond. We've seen them use the power of the purse with the FTC before. So we certainly know that there can be oversight by Congress when it comes to independent agencies. I also don't like the dichotomy that Blake set up of either like you approve of the fourth branch and independent agencies, or you're fully on with them all being subject to every one of the president's whims. I think there's an in-between. I have a lot of concerns about the role of the fourth branch, of the role of the administrative state, about the impact that it's putting on individuals and on society and on any number of things. I do also think, though, that we set up independent agencies with a form of oversight, that there are questions about what happens, why we set them up to be independent. Are we seeing things become politicized that we felt needed that form of independence? And that's why we need to have a different form of accountability, perhaps, for these independent agencies.
So real quick, building on both of these points. First, I agree with you, Tejas. And I would love for the agencies to be more overseen by and beholden to Congress as more responsive, but we're not seeing that. So another reason that we have especially independent agencies, most independent agencies are led by a panel of commissioners that have staggered terms that are longer than 4 years long. So they are meant to give some stability in policy that will outlive any single presidential term. And one of the weird things that we've seen is that hasn't really happened. For various reasons, a lot of it is the lack of congressional oversight or more direct congressional oversight. Agency policy has vacillated more by who's in the White House, which that's, again, another, I think, really important, giving stability of policy that outlives a single president. If we had that coming out of independent agencies, that'd be wonderful. But since we don't, that calls into question, I think, not necessarily the legitimacy of the structure, but the effectiveness. And if it isn't effective, that calls into the question of the legitimacy.
So I want to shift gears slightly. I know we were going to go to the courts, but I think we've been down the rabbit hole on Congress a bunch here. So let's keep going with that. So Jen, I'm going to come back to you real quickly. You sounded a little skeptical about what Congress has accomplished in terms of overseeing the agencies in the last year. Expand on that. What else about Congress?
So I think in some ways you can't fully talk about Congress, the courts, and the states entirely separately. They're each kind of feeding into each other, in part because of this question of what happens when Congress doesn't act on an issue that there is either political or public interest in. So on the one hand, we have seen the courts, as Gus will get more deeply into, really take away agency deference and try and put the power back in Congress. There's been ramblings around Humphrey's Executor with the Slaughter case and what that might mean for independent agencies and the oversight, whether we would continue to see this oversight by Congress, where we have seen Congress use things like the power of the purse, like having hearings of these agencies over what they're doing, various elements along the way to try and make sure that there are some proper political checks and balances and that independent agencies still have that responsiveness to the public. And then we've also seen that when it comes to issues like data privacy, like artificial intelligence, where there seems to be this desire for some sort of framework, that in the absence of congressional action, that either we see agencies stepping up without clear delegations, which raises questions around the non-delegation doctrine and whether or not we'll see a revival of that in the courts, but that we also see states stepping up to fill that vacuum and creating potentially other problems, questions related to dormant commerce clause when these issues often impact interstate boundaries. Also questions of what this can mean in terms of the disruption for a future federal framework, something that we've certainly seen in the debates over data privacy. Now, I do think there is some optimism out there of that we do see that Congress has at times stepped up both to provide agency oversight as well as attempting to have these conversations in very structured and measured way, particularly around issues where they know it's important that we get the policy framework right, like AI. But I think that oftentimes this is a very long process and that there's a kind of impatience between both agencies and the states to do something sooner, even when doing something sooner may not be the right answer. Sometimes actually the absence of policy and tech policy can be beneficial and allow innovation to evolve and allow societal norms to evolve and allow us to see how our existing laws will play out. In other cases, what we've seen though is that in the absence of that action, there may be either attempts to step up and regulate by agencies in the states without that same check that we would see if we saw a proper debate in Congress.
Tejas, can I come to you on this? Because I think you started us down the road with the thought that Congress ought to be filling the void in some way here. What's your take on how Congress has done in the last year?
Congress is done in the last year?
Or if at all.
I'm trying to think of how to diplomatically answer your question. Look,
It's this group of people that me.
So look, like we have, okay, so I'm trying to think about where exactly to start. Okay, look, there's an ideal story of Congress, that it is this democratic and deliberative body. And I love that ideal story of Congress. And we have drifted far from it. And I think the last year is an example of that. And now we have lots of efforts that are aimed at, in small ways, trying to get us back to that. Well, if we just overturn Chevron, then Congress will start legislating again. Or if we just do this thing, then Congress will start legislating again. And I don't think it's so easy. I don't know that I have the answer, but those little things are not going to fix, I think, what is a broader structural problem, and is maybe a broader structural problem with our politics, and that is well beyond the scope of our panel.
If I can make a comment / if Tejas won't mind a brief joke. When you did the introductions, you said that Berkeley was as far away from DC and out of the Beltway as you could get, but it's very close to Sacramento, if I recall. And oftentimes what has become de facto federal policy isn't necessarily coming out of Congress anymore. It's coming out of places like Sacramento.
I think for certain things, that's right.
All right, we're going to put a pin in that fight. We're going to go back to Sacramento in just a second. I'm going to come to Chris.
I was going to tell off.
All right, I go for it.
Or Berkeley is very close to what happens in Congress, because California has 50 some members of Congress.
For now.
They can really have a huge influence on pushing legislation. They can stop legislation. I mean, those of us who were advocating in 2021-22 for comprehensive privacy law, it was the California delegation that stopped ADPA, a compromised comprehensive privacy law, from getting a vote on the House floor after it passed the Energy and Commerce Committee by 50-2 or something. So it's very democratic. Everyone has representation. It is messy. And I think that was by design, because it's a limit on the sort of executive, dare I say, kingly state power that was the intention of the framers. And so in order to get policy done, sometimes we have to have compromise. Sometimes we have to have the messy state of Congress get together and find a way to balance values and priorities and stakeholders. And sometimes you lose when that happens, but it's a better system than executive authority only and letting the president just run rampshot over how money is spent and all the stuff we're seeing right now.
Gus, take us from Congress and take us to the courts.
Oh, I'm not going to go to the courts yet because Tejas, you opened a door that I have to go through. Thank you. So Tejas, you made the observation that so many of these issues are so much bigger than what's going on with this panel, and that is a really damn important point. So first, apparently there's some folks who are talking about repealing the 17th Amendment now. So we won't vote for our senators, the legislators of states. If this were to happen, they would select senators. Huh, well, that's interesting. I am in the process, I'm finishing up right now reading Robert Caro's bio of Robert Moses. And over the summer, I listened to, I didn't read the LBJ bio. It's both good, a great bio, you should read it, and also listen to it. Don't read it, it's too long. But worth every page if you listen to it. I don't know that at any point in history we would do better at trying to sort through these issues than today. That's a counterfactual question, but yeah, we're really dysfunctional in really important ways, but these are hard issues to figure out. And a lot of these issues about technology policy, they're changing our society, they're challenging our norms, they're making us question who we are, and that's good, that's healthy, that's normal. But thinking that, yeah, the right change in administrative law, doing away with Chevron is going to completely re-equilibrate how we function as a polity and get us back on track. That's a little higher pay grade than this panel. So I think that that's a really useful anchoring point for a lot of the discussions that we have. And it's also a call for us all to be involved in the political discussion and we can't just say, wow, everything's terrible. Someone should fix that. So it's a good reminder.
Tejas, you got a rejoinder, or should we move on?
I feel like I was being called out for saying Justice Scalia had a fever dream.
All right. On that note, let's pivot to the courts who have been invoked often here. So, Gus, how are the courts shaping the conduct and performance of independent agencies?
Yeah. So first, I do want to start thanking everyone for inviting me. Lovely to be here as always. I also want to call out Blake, who's on research leave right now. He shouldn't be here, but he loves you all. He loves it so much that he's willing to be here. When we're done, Blake, go get writing.
Yeah.
So always thrilled to be invited to talk about admin law because it's an opportunity to talk about Chevron. Chevron is dead, if you haven't heard. The Supreme Court overturned it 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, whatever, in Loper Bright. And this is probably admin law last couple of years. The big news that people talk about. What does this mean if you're an ad law prof? That's the question. No one knows what the future post Loper Bright is. We do know a couple of interesting things. So courts do still defer to agencies under a different standard, the Skidmore standard. In principle, courts review these questions de novo. However, agency input, the seriousness of agency policy is going to help courts decide when to defer or how much to defer to agencies. And this ties into two other really big topics. First is the Major Questions Doctrine, which is alive and doing better than ever. We're now seeing a lot of cases that invoke the Major Questions Doctrine, where courts, as they're being asked to interpret a statute post-Chevron, they're looking at a statute saying, this seems a really big question. Maybe Congress should provide us some more guidance. We're no longer going to let agencies update the law to track changes in technology. So we're seeing some of that. In fact, I need to say net neutrality. In the Eighth Circuit net neutrality opinion, the Eighth Circuit rejected. Sorry, 8 and 6. They look too similar. The Sixth Circuit rejected the 2024 rules on Loper Bright post-Chevron grounds, some inkling of Major Questions Doctrine. And one of the other really big things in there was the court looked at the history of the agency flip-flopping between administrations on the interpretation. And they said, yeah, you're not really a trustworthy narrator as to what the statute means. So we are going to read the statute and we don't think that it backs this up. Everything I say over the next few minutes is going to be an overly simplified gloss. I apologize, it's necessary. We'll come back to Chevron. Next really big admin law thing, a little further afield from stuff that folks in this room might be paying attention to, the Jarchese case, SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, where the Supreme Court called into question the ability of administrative agencies to issue fines that aren't issued subject with some jury trial right. There has the AMG case with the Federal Trade Commission, similar sort of case, dramatically limited the agency's ability to issue fines. And 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court granted cert in the Verizon and AT&T cases. Based upon Jarchese, the carriers are challenging the commission's ability to issue fines for violation of their rules. Again, overly simplified, but that could be a huge recalibration of the power of agencies. Next really big thing going on in administrative law land, even more of a sleeper, the corner post case. This could be a huge issue for established agency rules. The historic understanding is there's a statute of limitations. You need to bring a challenge to a rule when it's issued within that statute of limitations. The court said, no, the harm occurs when you become subject to the rule. That's when the statute of limitations starts tolling. So if you are a new entry into a regulated field and suddenly you're subject to these rules, you can challenge them. So if you want to challenge an existing FTC or FCC, FTC, any agency rule, just start up a new company, say, oh, I'm subject to your regulations now, I'm going to challenge this. Very likely we're going to start seeing more strategic litigation and just litigation challenging rules that we thought were long settled. Next up, Slaughter and Humphrey's Executor. Humphrey's Executor is dead precedent walking. I think there's very little doubt that it is going to be overturned. The question is how or on what grounds. I personally think, even after listening to the oral arguments, the court is not going to overturn Humphrey's Executor, but it's going to say that the modern FTC doesn't fit into the agency described at the time by the court in Humphrey's Executor. So the FTC no longer gets the benefit of that removability protection. But I already mentioned what my big question coming out of the Slaughter case was, this broader question of the reequilibration of the administrative state. So back to Chevron briefly. First, the justifications, the two big theories or discussion points with Loper-Bright killing Chevron. Some people looked at this and said, oh, the court is aggrandizing Article 3's power. It's bringing all the power to interpret statutes into the courts. The other view was the court is returning the authority to say what the law is to Congress. If there's an ambiguous statute, we can't just rely on the agencies to modernize it and pace it to changes in technology. Rather, that's the job of Congress. Both of these are probably right in a different measure, but those are kind of the two polar views. A lot of fighting over that. There is definitely a theory, there's definitely a hope, however, that it will help to depoliticize some amount of administrative law and agency law. Whether that actually happens is unclear. So much, however, of what we all love and hold dear is public convenience, interest, and necessity, whatever the heck that means, and unfair methods of competition, whatever the heck that means. And I expect that the courts are going to look at those statutes and say, what the heck do these mean? And be much more inclined to hand things off to Congress or the states. And unfortunately, I was going to originally go before Jennifer, and that was going to be the handoff.
Yeah.
So let me jump in here, and I think Gus has given us a lot to chew on. But one thing I want to zero in on is the last thing you said, Gus, that there's real tension between the court ergating power to itself, between that and the court shifting power to Congress. To Chris, where you started with are getting power to the president by way of the unitary executive theory and Slaughter and so forth. So what is really happening at the court? Are whether we want to be descriptive or predictive about it, where is the power that the court is taking from administrative agencies? Where is that going to end up? Like, does that make any sense?
I've got no idea. The possibly the weirdest thing I'll say, and I mentioned INS v. Chadha a little bit earlier. I grew up as a law student, a Scalia acolyte, formalism, structural constitution. This all made sense to me. INS v. Chadha rightly decided, unequivocally. Today, I read it and I read Justice White's dissent, and I say, my goodness, Justice White was right. Pre-INS v. Chadha, Congress had much more direct control and engagement with agencies and direct oversight. And the reality is, I'm also a law and econ guy. I believe in transaction costs. The transaction costs of a formal structural constitution are prohibitive as a reasonable form of contemporary governance. And as I said in my earlier response to Chris riffing on Humphrey's Executor, we're not in a stable, functional, operational equilibrium right now. I don't know. I think that in a very now I'm doing the Tejas, thinking, how do I want to say this? Do I want to say this? In either a very naive or a very 19-dimensional chess sort of way, the court is either trying to adhere to a understanding of a formalist structure of powers, separation of powers, understanding of the Constitution, that they think this is what the document says, this is how we need to read it, this is just right, or they are, and I don't think this is the case, I know this is naive Gus, not naive court, but they are pushing us to, hey, we need some bigger restructuring of how we operate this country, and this will push us to that crisis point that will lead to that restructuring.
Can I? Yeah. So if I were to answer your question about where does the power end up, I think the two moves, on the one hand, Chevron, major questions, on the other hand, Humphrey's Executor, I think they pull in different ways. I don't think it's necessarily like one movement. So if you're worried about independent agencies but want to do it under rule of law, I would say at least Chevron and major questions tends to do that. Now you can question it when the Eighth Circuit comes out, net neutrality number 2. If the Eighth Circuit comes out and decides,
by the way, we're gonna have like a net neutrality
Yeah.
swear jar here. So like we've let it slide so far, but it's gonna cost you $1 from here.
Sorry, number
on.
it was number 3. It was number 3.
The swear jar.
Yeah.
He gets all the money.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Eighth Circuit deciding what the authority is over broadband rather than kicking it back to Congress, I think argues towards the court deciding that the power moves to them. I think you're right. There's a real argument that the power could move back to Congress, but if the court doesn't let it move back to Congress by kicking the decision to Congress and saying, go through your messy political, compromise effort to figure out what the Communications Act means, then we don't get what I think is intended under the rule of law.
So this is a really great point,
Yeah.
and I know I've been talking a lot. I'll shut up after this. Both Chris and Blake, you're exactly right that Chevron and Humphrey's Executor, they are working together. I don't think intentionally, but they are working together in interesting ways. I mentioned in the Loper-Bright discussion, Fox v. FCC, the flip-flopping sort of thing. I expect that we are going to see much less of that highly politicized flip-flopping of agency interpretations of statutes post-Loper-Bright. And to the extent that we do worry, I think rightfully, that a loss of Humphrey's Executor will increase the politicization of agencies, the loss of the ability to flip-flop in agency interpretation of statutes will be a check on the danger that can work.
So I don't know if it's a bingo card or a swear jar, because it's my turn to say net neutrality. So I think if we get 5, then Tim Wu gets something at the end of the panel or whatever. Because I do think when we look at things like the decision around the Sixth Circuit decision around net neutrality being one of the first big trials of kind of what happens to admin law in a post-Loper-Bright world. It also raises that question of also, who are these decisions for? Who is the court actually trying to communicate with? Are they trying to communicate to the lower courts, to the circuit courts, to the district courts that now when you see these agency actions, this is what we want you to do? Are they trying to communicate to Congress like, hey, remember Article 1 exists? We'd like you to use it instead of just like letting agencies do anything? Are they trying to communicate to the agencies themselves? And if they are trying to communicate to the agencies themselves, are the agencies themselves actually listening? Or is this the type of thing that when we, for example, think about the contrast between, for example, the FCC considering net neutrality and also at one point considering rulemaking around content moderation in Section 230, that agencies are not necessarily taking into account fully what that interpretation might mean.
So Tejas, I'm going to come to you. Any parting shots, and then we should shift for our last few minutes to talk about states.
Well, let me just say one thing about the power shift and the idea that overturning Humphrey's executor will lead to more politicization and maybe power in the executive branch as opposed to the courts. And I just want to say that that's a little bit of an open question given how the argument went in Cook. That is, it might be that the court arrogates to itself the power to decide when these independent commissioners can and can't be fired through judicial review of for-cause removals. So I think like that still, the jury's still out. And that could be more Article 3 decision-making.
There was no cause in the removal of commissioners.
Oh, I agree, but like.
There was at least a veneer of cause in Lisa Cook, but yeah.
So Tejas, let's shift gears for our last few minutes, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. We've got a last set of institutions that are acting on federal administrative agencies, and that's in the states. Can you give us a brief tour, knowing that we are going to, in our next panel, shift to AI regulation, be talking about this in a lot of detail?
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to do this. I think what I'm going to do is try to offer a broad overview and maybe a little bit of some background in history, and then open it up. So, we can talk about state privacy regulations, state broadband regulation, state regulation of social media, or even state AI regulation. And I want to dive into some of those in a moment. But the first thing I want to point out is that, like, sort of across all of these scenarios, the states are the front line for governance between the relationship of some local consumer and some provider. And I think it's really easy and common even to sort of say, well, look, like, internet is a national global infrastructure. It needs national regulation. Social media platforms operate interjurisdictionally. So we should rely on federal authorities because what about dormant commerce clause? But like Target, Walmart, Safeway are all national companies that operate interjurisdictionally, and they can only build stores where they comply with local zoning rules. The stores have to comply with local wage and hour laws. They're subject to local consumer protection laws. And so I think the same is true. The exact same thing is true in internet and communications contexts. Wireless broadband companies have to comply with local zoning and tower siting rules. Technology companies have to comply with local employment rules. Broadband, where a broadband provider doesn't offer you the service it promises, it can be subject to consumer protection regulation. And so now the sort of history, right? We've recognized this for a long time. The story starts with 152B in Louisiana PSC, where we have these two visions, like an intrastate and interstate markets with different regulators. That doesn't work because the infrastructure is shared. So here's my nod to Phil Weiser, who says we move in the 1996 Act to a scheme of cooperative federalism where we use state regulation or implementation to achieve federal goals set out pursuant to a federal statute. Okay, so that's the history. Everyone in the room knows all that. As our focus has shifted from the infrastructural layers to the higher layers, it seems like the model of cooperative federalism has broken down, and we're moving towards a paradigm that I would characterize as adversarial federalism. Like, we have the states and federal authorities often acting actively against one another, in competition with one another. And a lot depends on how these conflicts shake out. So take, for example, the recent executive order on state AI regulation. So set aside the question of whether or not there's actually any legal authority to do any of the things that the order purports to do, and just sort of focus on the substance. Right. Colorado, here we are, enacts a law to address algorithmic discrimination by possibly requiring that AI developers correct for longstanding historical biases and training data when making predictions or recommendations about recidivism, or hiring. The order treats that law as a paradigmatic example of onerous AI regulation. California has enacted a bunch of laws, including transparency for foundation model developers, requiring that developers of companion chatbots develop protocols to address risks of self-harm, and holding companies liable for torts committed by agentic AI systems. All three of those laws might also be deemed onerous, though we don't know yet. But that relationship and how that cashes out is an example of the adversarial federalism between what's happening at the federal level, and particularly in the executive branch, and what states are trying to do in respect to the relationship between their local consumers and providers of AI services. You can also see examples of this adversarial federalism in the recent changes to the BEAD program, where NTIA has essentially required states to change the technology mix of their subgrantees, even where the states have a different perspective on like what the right technology mix is and what the right long-term investment in broadband ought to be. NTIA has threatened states that also try to regulate the relationship between local consumers and local providers of broadband through, say, rate regulation or affordability, like in New York. So if cooperative federalism is defined by the sense that we share a set of common goals and common aspirations, like Brett said earlier, universal, affordable access to communications technologies, but recognize in cooperative federalism that different states are going to take different paths to get there because of different values and different populations and different geographies, our current moment is defined by fundamental disagreements. Right? Like the Colorado law is blasted as onerous AI regulation because it is deemed untruthful. But that goes to sort of a basic disagreement between what the White House and what the Colorado lawmakers think truth means. Does truth mean a bare recitation of history, or does truth mean a correction for the mistakes of the past? Where does that leave us? I don't know. States do a lot by virtue of their direct relationship with local consumers and their ability to superintend those local transactions. But increasingly, the states have to fight to retain that power. And I don't have a clean upshot for what that's going to look like, but it's something we're figuring out. It's a new model of federalism for sure.
So I want to close with a question to the panel before we go to the audience with Tejas' provocative notion of adversarial federalism. Does the fighting among the branches of the federal government, we've talked about Congress, we've talked about the judiciary, we talked about the presidency and all the jockeying for power there, how does that shape that all of that infighting, the relationship between the federal government and the states? Thoughts?
Well, I just want to pick up on the phrase adversarial federalism because it's not where I thought he was going with it. I was waiting to hear him talk about, fights between Colorado and Texas, for example. And, when I hear the term adversarial federalism, what I was thinking of was more of the fact that we oftentimes, in the absence of a federal framework, have seen states with very different points of view over something like what truth is, trying to both regulate in ways that why it is so disruptive when it comes to communications technology is you can't possibly comply with both at the same time. And I think that's the real difference in the comparison to target local zoning laws, is that target building stores and having to comply with local zoning laws, is that we're running a risk with some of these technologies that these state level technology regulations mean that you cannot offer a product in every single state, and that it has far more elements that would impact things like speech rights, like privacy rights, like the ability to innovate and operate businesses. So I was a little surprised when you used adversarial federalism and went with the state federal dynamic as opposed to talking about the states arguing amongst themselves at some point. And I think that that's something that we have to consider when we think about this dynamic. It's a little weird to be a libertarian and talking about that many of these issues need to be on a national level when it comes to the internet or AI. I do think that there are roles for state and local governments to play. And I think that, to Tejas' point, that they are often places where people can more directly make decisions. And they're also places where they can more directly make decisions if they don't like the laws or if they don't like the framework. And we've seen businesses and individuals move as a result of disliking frameworks as well.
Lightning round. Closing thoughts from Gus and then
lightning round. 2 thoughts. So first, as a researcher and as an academic, one of my greatest frustrations in this area is the lack of empiricism and natural experiments and tests and laboratories of democracy. Hey, I could get behind this at some level, or find ways for regulators to do more experimentation. So much from a research perspective of the policy debates here can be boiled down to, that's just your opinion, man. That's like just your opinion. And I would love for us to have more actual honeypots and experiments that we could look at results of policy interventions and see what the results are on a small scale before deciding whether to scale them up. The second thing, which we should have in the discussion, with so much of technology policy, we can look from a national level internal to the states, but we also have the national competition between different countries. And there are definitely folks, especially, for instance, on the AI side today, who say, look, the United States is in a global competition against China and the European Union for artificial intelligence, and California is just going to kill us in the global economy. That's just something that should be percolated up into the discussion.
It almost seemed like you hand waved the authority question to us, but
did.
yeah, I don't understand why. I mean, we've seen the courts, to your question, Blake, step in and stop preemption of state laws, certainly when it comes to broadband policy, because the FCC declared it did not have authority over broadband. And then when states stepped in to create privacy laws or net neutrality laws, the courts made it clear, like, hey, you said you don't have authority, so the states can do what they want here. So I think authority matters. Certainly it matters when it comes to executive orders, which are, can't really govern preemption, to my knowledge. I'm not a lawyer, but that's my rough guess on it. And then it all ends up pointing back to the, whether you want to call it dysfunction or messy democracy that we have going on in Congress. It's the importance of it. I mean, can you do state level tech policy? Yes. Should you? It's probably not the best for the type of technology, and you kind of hand wave that too, because we're talking about, when it comes to broadband networks and networks, we're talking about platforms that ride over those networks. We're talking about a global economic engine here, and it seems like it's better to do it at the federal level. And the dysfunction is what's leading to it not being done there. And the responsiveness of federal policymakers is admirable, but probably not the best way to do it. Excuse me, federal, I meant state policymakers, yeah.
Well, we've heard some provocations against the notion of cooperative federalism and to actions by the states. And I'm reminded that in 10 minutes, we will have Phil Weiser, who wrote the article on cooperative federalism and is behind some of these very actions, to offer some thoughts. But before we do that, and because Phil is here, we've got to follow the Weiser rule and ask the first question to students. And I have clocked at least 3 students in this vicinity who I will call upon if they do not raise their hands, including one who's holding the microphone right now. So any volunteers?
I'm Juliana Blakely, and I have a question for Chris, mostly because this is payback, because yesterday he grilled me at the AI ethics competition. But
Juliana.
And maybe that's actually not a question for you, so anyone else can take it. But I'm thinking, the context is that there's an recent executive order where funding for broadband, billions in funding was threatened. And so with that backdrop, what do you think the impact is of the president essentially taking the power of the purse and bypassing Congress, while at the same time the president being able to also fire agency heads? What is the impact on citizens, but also on the industry as a whole?
It's lawlessness. The idea that the president can ignore appropriations law is lawlessness, plain and simple.
So I'll chime in first. huge rule of law questions about ignoring specific appropriations, but it also is worth having in the background. The power of the purse has long been one of the most important regulatory tools in the federal government.
Mhm.
Sometimes this is through congressional direction, other times it's through executive discretion. For students, if you have a chance to take a government procurement law class, it sounds super boring, and it is, but it's super important. And it's not at all new. So much of federal policy is decided and implemented by the executive through procurement decisions and policy. So worth having that in awareness.
All right, let's come down to the third row here for our next question.
So Henning Schultz from Columbia, a lot of a discussion, Tejas, you mentioned that, is we don't really know how to do this well. And this is a theme, as in, even if we weren't under the current constraints, we don't really know how to balance independent agencies versus Congress versus the courts in that. What I saw missing at the discussion is this is not a US problem, as in every single country that is not a pure dictatorship has that a version of that problem inflected by that. So I'm curious, to the extent that you want to comment on that, are there mechanisms in other countries or other regions, say the European Union, that at least point to either this is worse than what we have or get, or don't wish for that, or maybe that points to why where legislatures are actually, because they're not subject to these extreme supermajority requirements like they exist in the US, which was not mentioned at all, that essentially prevents legislative action in practice, that have found ways to delegate more authority, say, to the European Parliament or to national legislatures in that. So can we learn something from other regions that gets us out of this kind of mess where nothing actually happens because Congress can't actually act except in the most extreme circumstances?
All right, we've been very provincial. This is extra credit for our panel who's not prepared for these extra territorial questions.
I just
but,
brought up the global competition.
All right. Thoughts on the international approaches or comparative approaches?
So the first thing I was going to say in response is sort of exactly like what you said, which is that I think what your question points to is, number one, a sort of myopia and US centricism in the American Legal Academy. Having said that, two, I think certainly we can learn something. So we can certainly learn something by doing good comparative work. The question is, can we learn something that actually solves the problem? And I think the answer to that is maybe no, because our sort of institutional and constitutional and judicial constraints about like actually trying to reform our systems to maybe like have a more flexible approach to delegation and agencies. Like everything that we have tried to do in that regard over the last 25 to 30 years has in the last few terms been struck down. And so I'm not optimistic about our ability to draw those lessons from other jurisdictions and implement them here, but I think we could learn them.
So I'm a bit more patriotic about our system than that. The idea that Congress being dysfunctional means that it will always be dysfunctional, I think, is not fair. We have 225 years of congressional action that we can point to of actual compromise, whether you liked the compromise or not. So we can create policy. We have to have the will to do it, and the public has to demand it. I would also argue that independent agencies or regulatory agencies are an example of that. If you take the spectrum that we heard, Christopher Yu and Tim Wu lay out earlier of don't regulate too soon versus do nothing, regulatory bodies are an option in the middle there because they can recalibrate, they can move quicker, and they can do it with expertise. And it was an option we've taken for decades, and all of a sudden it's become controversial to do it, but it's possible.
Actually, it's not that I'm not patriotic. Like,
Noted for the record.
like no, I think it could you could have a will of Congress people to do something about it. But in terms of changing the actual institutional structures, there are just too many constraints that are coming out of things like the Slaughter case that'll make it hard for us to create new agency structures.
That's true. Yeah.
I will say, I think we've got two different visions of how to regulate. Don't just stand there, do something, and don't just do something, stand there. And for those of us who are disposed, like we could say, the Congress to be don't just do something, stand there, we learn a lot from the things that the European Union are doing.
Yes.
And I think hopefully the European Union will learn a lot from the things that it has done as well.
And there's alternatives to regulatory bodies. I mean, you could beef up Congress's ability to legislate. Now, it would take power out of the hands of the elected official by giving them more staff, more expertise, and giving more power to the staff. But I don't know how people would feel about that. So there's lots of alternatives in the middle.
I think we've got time for one more quick question to Russ in the fifth row there.
Thank you. So I'm just a simple country lawyer, and I'm hoping you can all help me with a constitutional question I have. So as I understand the unitary executive, the underpinnings of its constitutional basis with respect to agencies, it's that Article 2 gives the president and only the president the authority to direct executive action. And that's even true when the executive action is being undertaken by an agency created by Congress. If that's right, I think that what I don't understand is what then allows the president to jump the tracks into when the instances where the agency is exercising quasi-legislative authority in rulemaking. If the answer is, well, the Constitution gives Congress that authority and doesn't allow it to be delegated, why does it go to the president once the courts see that? And then if I'm right, or if that theory is right, it's not my theory, Paul. If that's the theory and it can jump the tracks, isn't the APA by definition unconstitutional insofar as it requires agencies to consider something other than the will of the executive?
I asked for a really quick question. We've got the entirety of con law. Does anyone want to offer up a 30-second thought?
10 seconds. I don't believe in unitary executive theory the way it's being proposed, and so that's your way out of the problem.
So the delineation between executive and legislative authority, blurry at times. I'm really interested to see what the court is going to say in the Slaughter opinion about that. If you look back at Humphrey's Executor, that was one of the key things that led to the court upholding the structure of the FTC at the time, that was doing quasi-legislative. It wasn't doing rulemaking at the time. It was advising Congress on rules for Congress to adopt. But it's a fascinating question, and I think we're going to need to wait to see what the court says in Slaughter, and there's going to be there will possibly be more articles written about the Slaughter opinion by the ad law crowd than were written about Chevron. I'll say that.
And before you go, Russ, I have to say, you have to come to my office after class to talk about your impertinence. But I would also point your attention to, I think a sleeper case is the Perlmutter case over the firing of the Register of Copyrights in the Librarian of Congress, where it turns out that Schoolhouse Rock lied to us in telling us that there are three clear branches of government. We've got executive functions being done in Congress, and we've got to figure out where that line is. Lots more to talk about. But Gus, I think you said stand up and do nothing. What I'm going to ask everyone to do is to stay seated and do nothing. We're going to do a break after our next panel, which is going to come up right now. But before they do, please join me in thanking these guys for a wonderful discussion.